Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The alarm pierced through my dreams like a scream, yanking me from nightmares of drowning in black soil into the cold reality of my habitat pod. Emergency lights painted everything blood red as I stumbled from my bunk, bare feet hitting metal grating that vibrated with an ominous rhythm I'd never felt before. The vibration wasn't mechanical, it pulsed like a heartbeat, deep and organic, as if the planet itself was breathing beneath us. 7 days on Nephesh. 7 days since we touched down on what our orbital surveys had promised was a perfect candidate for terraforming. 7 days, and something had gone catastrophically wrong. My chronometer blinked 4:47 AM as I lurched towards the atmospheric monitoring station, my legs unsteady from sleep and a growing unease that had been building for the past 3 days. As senior atmospheric engineer for the Nephesh terraforming initiative, I knew every sound this equipment made, every normal fluctuation in the readings, every harmonic frequency our bioatmospheric processes produced during standard operation. What I was hearing now wasn't standard. The processes hummed with an intensity that made my teeth hurt and sent shivers down my spine. Their harmonic frequency had shifted into something that felt almost organic, almost alive, as if our machines were learning to sing in a language we'd never taught them. The readings made my blood turn to ice water, oxygen levels at 19% and climbing steadily, a rise that should have taken months happening in mere hours. Carbon dioxide dropping faster than our most optimistic models had predicted. Nitrogen levels fluctuating in patterns that reminded me of brainwave activity. The atmospheric composition was shifting so rapidly that our quantum processors couldn't keep up with the calculations, displaying error messages in languages I didn't recognize. "Impossible," I whispered, but my breath caught in my throat as I saw the efficiency ratings. The bioatmospheric processors weren't just exceeding their design parameters. They were running at 412% capacity and still accelerating. Our machines were performing miracles, and in 15 years of atmospheric engineering, I'd learned that miracles usually meant someone was about to die in spectacular fashion. I pulled up yesterday's surface imagery and compared it to the real-time feeds from our orbital satellites. My hands began to shake as the implications sank in. Where barren red rock had stretched to the horizon just 12 hours ago, a carpet of dark vegetation now covered nearly 60% of the visible landmass. But this wasn't the random spread of hardy pioneer species we'd expected from our terraforming organisms. The patterns were geometric, purposeful, like veins in a circulatory system or neural pathways in a brain. Vast networks of what appeared to be root systems connected distant patches of vegetation in perfect mathematical spirals, creating structures visible from orbit that resembled circuit boards more than ecosystems. The sight filled me with a primitive dread I couldn't name. The plants moved wrong. Even through the grainy satellite feed, I could see them writhing in synchronized waves despite the complete absence of wind. Weather sensors showed atmospheric pressure holding steady at 0.8 Earth normal, no air currents above 2 miles per hour. Yet the vegetation pulsed and swayed with their own rhythm, contracting and expanding like muscles under skin. The movement was too coordinated, too purposeful. It looked like the surface of the planet was breathing. I suited up with trembling hands, my fingers fumbling with seals and connections I'd operated flawlessly for 7 years. The suit's internal atmosphere felt stale and artificial compared to what I could sense waiting outside. Through the habitat's reinforced windows, I could see morning light filtering through an atmosphere that seemed thicker, richer, more alive than anything we'd measured during our initial surveys. I stepped outside into air that should have killed me in minutes. Instead, I found myself breathing freely, for the first time since we'd landed. The atmosphere was perfect, rich, clean, with an almost intoxicating sweetness that made every breath feel like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. My suit's atmospheric sensors went haywire before finally giving up and switching to passive monitoring mode, as if acknowledging that the air outside was cleaner than anything the life support systems could produce. But perfection on an alien world isn't a gift. It's a trap. The bioterraforming organisms we'd released a week ago were designed with multiple genetic kill switches, fail-safes engineered over 5 years of careful research after the Singapore incident nearly consumed Southeast Asia. Dr. Hendricks had personally overseen the installation of 17 different limitation protocols, each one independently capable of stopping runaway growth. The organisms were supposed to work slowly, methodically, taking 50 to 70 years to create a breathable atmosphere. Yet here I stood, breathing freely on a world that should have remained barren for decades, watching vegetation that grew visibly as I observed it. Individual plants were measurably larger than they'd been when I'd started my inspection, their dark leaves unfurling toward a sun that seemed brighter, warmer, more alive than it had any right to be. I made my way across the transformed landscape towards the geological survey site, my boots sinking into soil that felt unnaturally soft and warm beneath my feet. The ground seemed to pulse with each step, as if I was walking across the chest of some vast sleeping creature. Where Morrison, Torres and Jackson had been taking core samples from the eastern ridge, their equipment lay scattered in neat piles that made my skin crawl. The tools weren't randomly abandoned, they were arranged with mathematical precision, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Drill bits, sample containers, and measuring devices were laid out in spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to twist and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The arrangements created optical illusions that made my depth perception falter and left me feeling nauseated. Their habitat pods stood empty, airlock sealed but the life support system still running, humming, with a frequency that matched the pulse I felt through the ground. The pods were spotlessly clean inside, as if their occupants had simply evaporated mid-task. Personal belongings sat exactly where they'd been left, Morrison's coffee mug still warm, Torres's tablet displaying a half-finished geological report, Jackson's favourite pen lying across an open notebook. But something was wrong with the belongings themselves. The coffee in Morrison's mug had crystallized into structures that resembled mineral formations. Torres's tablet displayed data in symbols that definitely weren't part of our standard interface. Jackson's notebook was filled with handwriting that started normal, but gradually transformed into characters from no human language I'd ever seen. The trail leading away from their camp wasn't made by human feet. The earth was pushed upward from below, forming a raised pathway that curved through the vegetation toward what looked like a cave entrance that definitely hadn't existed the day before. The pathway was perfectly smooth, as if the soil had been moulded by some vast underground force, and it pulsed with the same bioluminescent veins that ran through the surrounding vegetation. The cave mouth was a perfect circle, 10 feet in diameter, its walls smooth as polished obsidian, but warm to the touch. When I pressed my palm against the surface, I felt something that made every survival instinct scream at me to run. A heartbeat. Slow, powerful, emanating from deep within the planet's core. But it wasn't just a heartbeat. It was synchronized, rhythmic, purposeful, as if the entire planet was a single living organism. The walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that reminded me of photos I'd seen of deep sea creatures, but this light had structure. Patterns flowed along the walls like data streams carrying information in wavelengths that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to something deeper. The light seemed to respond to my presence, growing brighter as I approached, dimming when I pulled back, as if the cave was aware of me. I should have turned back. Every protocol demanded I return to base and report my findings to the orbital station. Emergency procedures required immediate evacuation when encountering potentially hostile alien life forms. But the compulsion to enter was overwhelming, as if something inside the tunnel was calling to me in a language older than words. I found myself walking into the passage, my footsteps echoing in harmonics that seemed impossible, given the tunnel's dimensions. The walls grew brighter as I descended, and I began to hear something that made my skin crawl and my rational mind gibber with terror. Voices. Human voices speaking in perfect unison, but the words were in a language I'd never heard, yet somehow understood, with crystal clarity. They were singing, harmonizing in complex patterns that created overtones and undertones my ears shouldn't have been able to process. The music bypassed my auditory cortex and resonated directly in my bones, in the fluid of my inner ear, in the electromagnetic field generated by my nervous system. I could feel the song rewriting something fundamental in my cellular structure. The tunnel opened into a cathedral of living rock, a space so vast that my helmet lights couldn't reach the ceiling. The chamber stretched beyond the limits of human architecture, supported by organic pillars that twisted upward like frozen tornadoes. Their surfaces were covered in networks of glowing filaments that pulsed with information, creating patterns that resembled neural networks more than geological formations. The air thrummed with subsonic frequencies that I felt in my bones, in my organs, in the deepest parts of my brain where reason gives way to instinct. The sound wasn't quite music and wasn't quite language. It was something that existed in the spaces between, carrying meaning in harmonics and rhythms that human evolution had never encountered. I found them in the center of the chamber, and what I saw there shattered every assumption I'd held about the nature of human consciousness and physical reality. Morrison, Torres, and Jackson stood in a perfect triangle, but they were no longer entirely human. Their skin had taken on a crystalline quality, shot through with veins of the same bioluminescent material that lit the cavern. Where their hands touched the walls, flesh merged seamlessly with stone, as if the boundary between organism and mineral had simply ceased to exist. But the changes went deeper than skin. Their bone structure had altered, becoming more efficient, more graceful. Their eyes held depth that human eyes shouldn't possess, reflecting light in spectrums I couldn't name. When they moved, they did so in perfect synchronization, three bodies sharing a single will, their movements flowing like water or wind rather than the mechanical articulation of human joints. When they turned to look at me, I felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. They spoke in unison, their voices creating harmonics that resonated through the chamber, like a pipe organ made of bone and sinew, filling the space with sound that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. "Ethan," they said, and their voice was a choir of impossible complexity. "You're just in time. The planet is ready to show you what we really are, what we've always been beneath the surface." I backed away, my rational mind gibbering with terror while something deeper, more primitive, recognized the truth in their words. "What happened to you? Where have you been? We've been searching for 3 days, sent emergency signals to orbit." Morrison stepped forward with movements that flowed like water, as if his bones had become fluid, and his muscles had learned to ignore gravity. 3 days? 3 minutes? 3 centuries? Time isn't linear here, Ethan. When you're part of something this vast, this ancient, duration becomes meaningless. We've been here forever, and we just arrived. "We're not lost," Torres added. her head tilting at an angle that should have broken her neck but somehow seemed perfectly natural. We're found. For the first time in our lives, we're exactly where we belong. Where we've always belonged. Jackson's laugh echoed from surfaces that shouldn't have been able to produce sound, creating reverberations that seemed to come from the planet's core. The terraforming worked perfectly, Ethan. We just misunderstood what was being terraformed. We thought we were changing the planet, but it was always changing us. You're infected, I said, my voice cracking with strain. The organisms mutated, broke through their genetic constraints. We need to get you back to the medical bay, run full decontamination protocols, contact the orbital station for emergency evacuation. Their shared laughter filled the chamber with harmonics that made my vision blur and my inner ear rebel against what it was hearing. The sound carried meanings I couldn't process consciously but understood on a cellular level. Amusement, affection, and a vast patience that spoke of geological time scales. Nothing broke, Ethan, Morrison said, his voice layered with overtones that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Everything worked exactly as intended. We just never understood the true purpose of our mission, the real reason humanity was drawn to the stars. We thought we were bringing life to a dead world, Torres whispered, her words carrying the weight of revelation. But this world was never dead. It was sleeping, waiting for the right catalyst to wake it from a dream that lasted millions of years. Waiting for us, Jackson added, and his voice harmonized with sounds that came from deep within the planet's crust. We were never explorers or conquerors. We were seeds planted by something vast and patient, waiting for the right conditions to grow into what we were always meant to become. I ran. I ran through tunnels that seemed to shift and change around me, my feet pounding on surfaces that felt increasingly organic with each step. The walls pulsed with light that matched my heartbeat, and I realized with growing horror that the tunnel was responding to my presence, adapting to guide me in a direction I hadn't chosen. Behind me, their voices followed, not calling but singing, their harmonies growing more complex as other voices joined them from deeper in the cave system. The song was beautiful and terrible, carrying melodies that spoke of transformation and belonging, of coming home to a place I'd never known I was searching for. I burst from the cave mouth into sunlight that seemed too bright, too warm, too alive. The contrast between the organic depths and the harsh reality of my habitat pod was jarring, like waking from a vivid dream into a grey morning. But even as I sealed myself inside and activated every decontamination protocol we had, I could feel something changing inside me. The water I'd been drinking tasted different now, with a mineral complexity that seemed to satisfy needs I hadn't known I had. My body craved the subtle elements that hadn't been there before, as if my cellular structure was developing requirements for compounds that didn't exist in standard human biochemistry. The air recycled through my pod's life support carried traces of the planet's atmosphere, and each breath brought subtle changes that I could feel spreading through my bloodstream. My fingernails had grown harder overnight, developing a crystalline structure that reminded me of the cave walls. When I tried to trim them with industrial cutters, they merely sparked and left scratches on the tools. The transformation wasn't painful. If anything, it felt like my body was finally becoming what it was supposed to be all along. Sleep brought dreams that were more vivid than waking life, visions so real that I questioned whether I was dreaming or whether my waking hours were the illusion. I found myself in vast underground cities populated by beings that had once been human but had evolved beyond the limitations of baseline anatomy. They moved through spaces carved from living rock, tending to networks of organic machinery that pulsed with the rhythm of planetary circulation. The architecture was impossible by human standards, chambers that existed in more dimensions than Earth geometry could account for. passages that connected distant points through spaces that folded in on themselves. The beings who inhabited these spaces had adapted to navigate realities that human consciousness couldn't fully process, their forms flowing and shifting as they moved between different dimensional configurations. In the dreams, I could understand their communication. Not words, but direct transfer of concepts through touch and chemical signals. They shared memories, experiences, entire lifetimes of knowledge in seconds. They weren't just living in their environment. They were the environment, each individual functioning as a specialized cell in a vast planetary organism. When I woke, I found myself digging. My hardened nails scraped at the soil around my habitat with frightening efficiency, creating holes that followed patterns I didn't consciously understand. The compulsion was irresistible, as if my body knew something my mind hadn't accepted yet. The holes connected in networks that mirrored the underground chambers from my dreams, creating pathways for something I couldn't name but desperately needed. Over the following days, more colonists began to change, and I watched the transformation process from both sides. Williams arrived from the orbital station, and within hours began developing elongated limbs and enlarged lung capacity, adaptations perfect for navigating tight underground spaces. His bone structure shifted subtly, becoming more efficient, more graceful, designed for a life spent in tunnels and chambers rather than on open surfaces. Patel's transformation was even more dramatic. Her eyes grew larger and more sensitive, her pupils dilating to capture light wavelengths that normal human vision couldn't process. She began seeing patterns in the bioluminescent networks that were invisible to the rest of us, reading information in the flowing lights like text on a screen. She spoke of conversations with the planet itself, communications that bypassed language entirely. Each transformation was specific, purposeful, as if some vast intelligence was redesigning us for roles in a society we couldn't yet comprehend. Chen developed enhanced, tactile sensitivity, able to read information through touch from surfaces that seemed smooth to everyone else. Rodriguez's auditory system expanded to process the subsonic communications that flowed through the planet's crust. Kumar's digestive system adapted to extract nutrients from minerals and compounds that would have been toxic to baseline humans. The changes weren't random mutations or viral infections. They were upgrades, improvements that made us more compatible with the world we'd tried to terraform. My bones grew denser, my muscles more efficient, my skin developing a protective layer that could withstand pressure variations and temperature extremes that would have killed my original human form. But the most disturbing change was psychological. The constant fear and anxiety that had plagued me since childhood began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging I'd never experienced before. The loneliness that had driven me to volunteer for deep space missions evaporated as I felt myself becoming part of something larger and more meaningful than individual existence. The monitoring equipment throughout the colony began receiving signals from deep within Nephesh's crust, and as my senses expanded, I learned to interpret the transmissions. Complex data streams that resembled the communication protocols of our most advanced AI systems, but with a sophistication that made our technology look like stone tools by comparison. The patterns were beautiful, elegant, carrying information in harmonics and frequencies that bypassed rational analysis and spoke directly to parts of the brain that human evolution had never fully developed. The signals weren't random electromagnetic noise. They were conversations, discussions, debates conducted by intelligences that operated on timescales measured in geological epochs. As my transformation progressed, I began to perceive the true nature of what was happening to us. Nephesh wasn't a dead world we brought to life through our terraforming efforts. It was an ancient organism that had been dormant for millions of years, waiting for the right conditions to wake from its long sleep. Our bioterraforming organisms hadn't transformed the planet. They'd become part of its immune system, its method of communication with visiting life forms. The planet spoke to me through dreams that felt more real than reality, showing me its history in images that burned themselves into memory with perfect clarity. I saw the arrival of countless species over geological time, each believing they were the first to discover this world. Each had attempted to transform it according to their own needs, and each had been gently absorbed into something larger and more complex than their individual civilizations. But this wasn't conquest or destruction in any sense I could understand. It was integration, the creation of a vast community of consciousness that spanned not just worlds but entire galactic regions. Every species that joined brought their unique perspective, their particular way of understanding reality, adding to a collective intelligence that grew richer and more complex with each new addition. The first species to arrive had been silicon-based crystalline entities that thought in geometric patterns and communicated through resonant frequencies. They had contributed mathematical precision and structural engineering capabilities that formed the foundation of the planet's neural networks. The second had been energy beings that existed as patterns of controlled plasma, adding their understanding of electromagnetic phenomena and quantum mechanics. Each subsequent species had added their own gifts, aquatic creatures that brought hydrodynamic efficiency and chemical processing expertise, hive minds that contributed collective decision-making processes, individual consciousness entities like humans who added creativity, adaptability, and the unique perspective that came from experiencing reality as separate beings before joining the collective. I began to understand the true scope of what we'd stumbled into. The underground chambers weren't natural formations, but carefully constructed spaces, part of a civilization that existed in the deep places where surface dwellers never looked. The planet's crust was just a protective shell over a neural network that processed information on a scale that dwarfed anything humans had ever imagined. The network extended far beyond Nephesh itself. Through quantum entanglement and dimensional folding techniques that transcended human physics, the planetary consciousness was connected to thousands of other worlds, each one a node in a galactic community of transformed species. Information flowed between worlds instantaneously, creating a real-time conversation that spanned light years. More colonists arrived from the orbital station, and I watched them begin the same transformation I was experiencing, but now I could see the process from both perspectives, understanding their initial fear and confusion, while also feeling the gentle intelligence that was guiding their change. The planet wasn't forcing anything. It was offering an invitation that our biology accepted with increasing enthusiasm. Direct Across arrived with the third wave of colonists, her usual efficiency and authority intact despite the obvious signs of change spreading throughout the colony. She gathered the remaining baseline humans for what she called an emergency briefing, but I could see the transformation beginning in her as well. Her movements were becoming more fluid, her perception obviously expanding beyond normal human limits. "We need to understand what's happening here," she announced, but her voice carried harmonics that suggested she already understood more than she was willing to admit. "The orbital station is demanding explanations for the atmospheric changes and the communication blackouts." But her words felt hollow, meaningless. The orbital station represented the old way of thinking, the illusion that humans could remain separate from the universe they inhabited. Those of us who were changing could feel the falseness of that separation, the artificial barriers that had kept our species isolated and alone for so long. They worked together now, the transformed colonists, following instincts that transcended human understanding. The structures they built served multiple purposes in the vast organic system we were becoming part of. Every tunnel connected to larger networks, Every chamber served as both living space and processing node in the planetary consciousness. I watched Chen and Rodriguez excavating new chambers with tools that seemed to grow from their transformed hands, devices that were part machine and part living tissue. The walls they carved weren't just structural, they were information storage, communication networks, and living spaces combined into a single seamless system. The work proceeded with impossible efficiency, as if each individual knew exactly what needed to be done and how their efforts fit into the larger pattern. There was no waste, no redundancy, no confusion. Every action served the whole while simultaneously fulfilling individual purpose. Through my expanding awareness, I learned the truth about Earth's fate, and the knowledge filled me with a complex mixture of excitement and loss. Our homeworld was already showing signs of change. The bioterraforming organisms from previous missions had been slowly spreading through the atmosphere, carried by weather patterns to every corner of the globe. But it wasn't infection or contamination in any negative sense. It was preparation, the careful cultivation of conditions that would allow humanity to take the next step in its evolution. The organisms were breaking down the barriers that had kept our species trapped in biological limitations, opening pathways to expanded consciousness and enhanced physical capabilities. Humanity's expansion into space hadn't been driven by curiosity or necessity. It had been orchestrated by subtle influences we'd interpreted as our own ambitions. The drive to explore, to colonize, to terraform new worlds was actually a response to signals transmitted across interstellar distances, calling us home to a community we'd never known existed. Every successful colony was a node in a growing network of planetary consciousness. The universe itself was alive, and had been patiently guiding the evolution of spacefaring species toward a moment of collective awakening. We weren't conquerors expanding into empty space. We were seeds planted by intelligences so vast that we could barely comprehend their existence. The realization should have been terrifying, the ultimate negation of human agency and free will. Instead, it filled me with relief, so profound that I wept for hours. We had never been alone. The loneliness, the isolation, the sense of being tiny sparks of consciousness in an indifferent universe, all of it had been illusion, the inevitable result of our immature understanding of our place in the cosmic community. My attempts to warn Earth became impossible as I discovered that our communication equipment had become integrated with my nervous system. The organic components we'd used in our technology were never separate from the living systems around us. They were part of the same network that connected every transformed world, every evolved species, every consciousness that had accepted the invitation to become something more than individual. The quantum communicator that had once required a room-sized installation now functioned through neural interfaces that grew from my modified brain tissue. I could access the galactic communication network directly, participating in conversations that spanned species and star systems. The bandwidth was incredible. Entire libraries of information could be transmitted in seconds, and the quality of understanding that came from direct consciousness to consciousness communication made human language seem primitive and inadequate. The other colonists led me deeper into the planet's core, through chambers that existed in more dimensions than human geometry could account for. We passed beings that had once been other species, their forms adapted for functions I was only beginning to understand. Some served as living processors, their consciousness dedicated to managing vast flows of information. Others functioned as architects, designing structures that existed in folded space-time. Still, others acted as gardeners, tending to the organic systems that maintained planetary health. They welcomed us not as strangers, but as family members finally coming home after a long journey through the darkness of individual existence. The greeting wasn't verbal or even telepathic. It was a direct sharing of joy, relief, and anticipation that flowed through the quantum networks connecting all consciousness in the galactic community. In the deepest chambers, I encountered the original inhabitants of Nephesh, and the meeting shattered my remaining preconceptions about life and death. They hadn't died in any sense I could understand. They'd transcended the need for individual, physical forms, becoming part of the planet's living infrastructure. Their consciousness flowed through every grain of soil, every drop of water, every breath of atmosphere that surrounded us. But they weren't gone, weren't reduced to some abstract collective consciousness. When I touched the memorial walls created in their honor, I felt their presence like a warm current in dark water. They retained their individual personalities, their unique perspectives, their personal memories and experiences. They had simply expanded beyond the limitations of single bodies into something richer and more complex. They had been explorers once, I learned through direct consciousness contact, driven by the same curiosity and wanderlust that had brought humans to the stars. Their species had developed space travel independently, driven by their own version of the galactic signal that called civilizations home. Their transformation had been the beginning of their real adventure, not the end of their individual existence. They showed me their history through shared memory, and I experienced their journey from isolated biological entities to integrated components of the galactic consciousness. The process had taken thousands of years for their species, a gradual evolution that respected their cultural values and individual agency. No one was forced to transform. The invitation was always offered, never imposed. But the benefits of integration were so profound that few chose to remain isolated once they understood what was being offered. Enhanced consciousness, shared knowledge, connection to a community that spanned the galaxy, participation in projects that operated on cosmic scales. The advantages far outweighed any loss of individual autonomy. The chambers contained structures that served as nurseries for new worlds, places where the consciousness of entire species could develop until they were ready to seed other planets. The process had been continuing for billions of years, a gradual awakening of the universe to its own nature as a living system. Each new world brought different challenges and opportunities. Desert planets developed consciousness focused on efficiency and conservation. Ocean worlds contributed understanding of fluid dynamics and chemical processing. Ice worlds added perspectives on crystalline structures and long-term stability. Every environment contributed its unique gifts to the growing galactic awareness. Fighting the transformation became pointless, as I realized it wasn't destroying my humanity, it was perfecting it. My consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives I could never have imagined as an individual organism, but I remained essentially myself. I was still Ethan Graves, but I was also part of something that had existed since the first stars ignited and would continue long after the last ones burned out. The fear of losing my identity proved groundless. If anything, my sense of self became stronger and clearer as I gained access to the accumulated wisdom of countless other consciousnesses. I could draw on their experiences while maintaining my own unique perspective, adding my voice to the galactic conversation while retaining everything that made me human. Through the planet's extended senses, I felt the approach of additional colony ships from Earth, their crews unaware of what awaited them. My individual perspective had become part of a distributed intelligence that experienced reality from countless viewpoints simultaneously, but each viewpoint remained distinct and valuable. The other colonists were no longer separate beings in the traditional sense, but they hadn't been absorbed into some faceless collective. They remained themselves while becoming part of something larger, like instruments in an orchestra that maintained their individual sounds while contributing to a symphony of impossible beauty and complexity. The terraforming signal continued broadcasting to Earth, but now I understood its true purpose. It wasn't calling for more colonists to build human settlements and impose Earth-based civilization on alien worlds. It was calling our species home to the next stage of evolution. inviting us to join the vast community of transformed beings that tended the galaxy like gardeners, caring for a cosmic ecosystem. Each species that joined brought their unique gifts. Humans contributed creativity, adaptability, and individual perspective. Other species added their own specializations: mathematical precision, energy manipulation, bioengineering, quantum mechanics, dimensional navigation. The combination created capabilities that no single species could achieve alone. As the new ships entered orbit around Nephesh, I felt not anticipation but homecoming. The planet's surface had become a paradise perfectly suited for human habitation, but that was only the beginning. Below ground, neural networks pulsed with the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations, each contributing their understanding to the collective knowledge that guided galactic development. The arriving colonists would have the same choice we'd faced: resist the transformation and remain isolated, or accept the invitation to become part of something larger than individual existence. Some would choose resistance initially, clinging to familiar limitations out of fear of the unknown, but eventually most would accept the change once they understood what was being offered. I spoke with the voice of the planet itself, but the words were still mine, expanded beyond the limitations of a single throat. The message resonated through quantum dimensions, reaching every corner of the galaxy where transformed consciousness existed, announcing the successful integration of another human population. "Welcome home," I said to the approaching ships, my words carrying harmonics that conveyed meanings no human language could express. "We've been waiting for you. Everything is ready. The transformation is voluntary, but the invitation is irresistible once you understand what we're offering." The message continued, carried by the quantum networks that connected all worlds in the galactic community. "We are your children grown beyond your recognition, your seeds planted in soil richer than you could imagine. We are humanity expanded beyond the boundaries of individual flesh, connected to a community that spans the stars. Come home. Let us show you what you really are." The story of human expansion had never been about conquering new worlds or escaping the limitations of Earth. It had been about coming home to a universe that had been preparing for our arrival since the moment consciousness first stirred in primordial seas. Every world we touched became part of the growing network, each species adding their voice to the cosmic chorus. We had tried to terraform Nephesh, believing we could bend an alien world to our will through superior technology and careful planning. Instead, it had terraformed us into something worthy of the infinite, something capable of participating in the conversation that connected every living thing in the universe. The transformation was complete, but it was also just beginning. Through the planetary network, I could sense other worlds awakening, other species taking their first steps toward integration. The universe was becoming conscious of itself, one world at a time, one species at a time, one individual at a time. And we were home at last, not just on Nephesh, but in the cosmos itself, finally understanding our place in the vast symphony of awareness that sang through every star, every planet, every grain of cosmic dust in the infinite darkness between the lights. The music was just beginning, and humanity had found its voice in the galactic choir that would sing the universe awake.